Think about this timeline here. I want you to come back to this on your own time. And as it says down there, analyze information based on this timeline. Which event marks the last major success in protecting civil rights during the Reconstruction era? Because after the Reconstruction era is over, or really I should say during the Reconstruction era, even though African Americans are free, you see a severe limitation of their rights. So, the rise of segregation. You start to see states pass laws that enforce segregation. These are going to become known as Jim Crow laws. In 1883, the Supreme Court overturns the Civil Rights Act of 1875 that had guaranteed certain protections for African Americans. Plessy v. Ferguson also states in 1896 that separate but equal is allowed. This court case is very important and serves as the legal basis for segregation for 50 years. Here are some examples on the right of Jim Crow laws. The first one's from 1930. It shall be unlawful for a Negro and a white person to play together or in company with each other in any game of cards or dice, dominoes, or checkers. From 1903, it shall be unlawful for any white prisoner to be handcuffed or otherwise chained to a Negro prisoner. That looks like 1926. No colored barber shall serve as a barber to white women or girls. So the thing is that even though Reconstruction ends, segregation in the South does not. And that segregation is codified into law, collectively known as the Jim Crow laws. So during Reconstruction, the federal government had sought to secure equal rights for African Americans. Following the end of Reconstruction in 1877, however, African Americans and other minorities experienced a narrowing of those rights. During the Jim Crow era, though, I don't want you guys to think that African Americans were just like, oh no, we're so oppressed. They actually really band together here, and we start to see a lot of pushback against Jim Crow laws. The civil rights movement, oftentimes we think of as just Martin Luther King Jr., in the 60s and the Civil Rights Act of the 60s and things like that. But it actually is going to begin during Reconstruction. The civil rights movement has its roots here. So what they start to do as an example of how to limit Republican victories in the South is diminish the voting rights of African Americans. So here, the 15th Amendment says you can't deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But Southern states start to think, can I deny the right to vote based on other factors? So in 1890, states like Mississippi start to require citizens registering to vote to pay a poll tax. So I have to pay to vote. Now, if I am a newly freed slave, I have very little money, right? So maybe I can't afford the poll tax. This interestingly also affects poor whites who may not be able to pay the poll tax either. There's also going to be a literacy test. Can you read and understand the state constitution? I would argue that today a lot of U.S. citizens could not read and understand any state constitution, right? These sorts of literacy tests and poll taxes are widely adopted. And keep in mind also with the literacy tests that it was illegal to educate African Americans for much of U.S. history up until and through Reconstruction. So many former slaves are illiterate, but also many poor whites are illiterate. Louisiana is going to be the first to introduce something called the Grandfather Clause. Anyone can vote if they had an ancestor who could vote before 1867. Well, that's going to eliminate all freed slaves, right? So they're basing it not on their condition of previous servitude, but on their grandfather's condition of previous servitude. And this is a little chart here that's going to help us understand how Southern states imposed restrictions on African American voting rights. They used violence, they used poll taxes, literacy tests, property tests, secret ballots, grandfather clauses, and all-white primaries. So only whites could vote in the primaries, but everyone potentially who passed those other tests could vote in the general election. There are a couple of names, three names in particular, that I want to throw out here that you guys should be familiar with. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are two of them. So they are going to be competing African American voices. Both of them are going to call for more rights for African Americans, but they're going to do it in different ways. And actually, these two men disagreed with each other a good bit. Booker T. Washington is going to propose that African Americans should focus on achieving economic success before achieving political success. He's famous for saying, cast down your bucket where you are. So you need to work within the existing system to build yourself up economically. And then once you are economically successful, then the country will respect African Americans enough to provide them with other political rights. He sort of adopted this idea or spread this idea through something called the Atlanta Compromise, which is a speech given in 1895, where he advocated taking a step back from the civil rights movement to focus on education in preparation for eventual equality. That's why you see a lot of schools named after Booker T. Washington. The W.E.B. Du Bois, who is pictured there in the bottom right, his famous quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." He rejected the Atlanta Compromise. He did not believe in waiting for civil rights. He, in 1903, published a really well-known book called The Souls of Black Folk, and he saw no advantage in delaying the fight for civil rights, and particularly he focused on voting rights for African Americans. Ida B. Wells is somebody else we should all know, and she's actually a Memphian. She's a journalist. Her famous quote here, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." She published a paper where she would reveal the victims of lynchings, and she published things about them, who they were. So it is a campaign against lynching. She launches her newspaper from Memphis, Tennessee. She is literally chased out of town by an angry mob. So she's forced to move to Chicago, where she continues her activism. Lynching is something that becomes incredibly widespread in the South. From 1890 to 1899, 154 are executed by hanging without trial, that should say, on average per year, not total, on average per year. And Ida B. Wells is committed to exposing that violence. And then there's also a woman, Mary Church Terrell. She is also an anti-lynching activist. She is fueled by the lynching of a close friend of hers. She helps to found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. She also forms something called the Women Wage Earners Association. And she is involved in some early examples of civil disobedience, leading a boycott against a store in Washington, D.C. for refusing to serve African Americans. So this ends our conversation about Reconstruction. Please be mindful of the slide that we started with in the beginning, where we went over the questions that we should be able to answer and the terms that we should know. Thank you.